Hello, I am Michael Brennan Dougherty, and Freddie, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Freddie deBoer. I'm a graduate student studying literacy education at Purdue University. I write at my personal website, and I've written for places like Jacobin and The New Inquiry.
Yep. I am Michael Brennan Dougherty, the host of the show. I am a new senior correspondent at The Week. I'm the editor of a baseball newsletter, the Slurve, and I am a minimum wage Wolverine impersonator. So, Freddie, I wanted to talk to you because we suffered about 3 weeks of media coverage, head-scratching, grundle-scratching about Richard Sherman, the cornerback of the Seattle Seahawks, in the lead-up to the Super Bowl. And you wrote, I think, a brilliant post on it on your personal blog, and I'd like you just to talk about the media reaction and your assessment of it a little bit.
Yeah, I will. I'll preface this by saying that, I'm someone with a really high tolerance for sort of the culture war element of politics, because I think that a lot of these things just aren't. You can't extract them from the sort of particular policy or political debates that we're having. But during this whole thing, I was thinking yeah, this is when people talk about living in culture war. I feel like this is what they're complaining about. And I was in a position that I often frequently feel myself in, which is, to the degree that you had to be on a side, I was on Richard Sherman's side in the sense of, I think a lot of the people who were going after him were being really stupid and insensitive, and I did think a lot of it was very kind of racially coded.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree with the sentiment that says, this is a sport where people regularly leave on stretchers, and now people are complaining about how indecorous he was.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I thought the response became something that is very classic in contemporary liberalism, which is Richard Sherman became the symbol of the good black person, and that is something that has sort of followed liberalism throughout the kind of evolution of America's racial discourse. And, it gets more sophisticated. So I said in the post, in the 90s, this represented itself in a lot of movies where you would have, the character of the just impossibly saintly black man, right? Someone who was totally sexless and wise and just, impossibly noble. And like I said, that, that is dehumanizing because no human being actually exists that way. And I feel like people became so invested in opposing what it really was a very stupid response to Richard Sherman, and when people calling him thug, which I agree, I think is a coded way to call him the N-word. But they went so far with it that, they invented this idea of Richard Sherman as this left-wing hero. And at some point when you become so invested in that, and when every day you're finding more and more kind of hyperbolic ways to talk about how great he is, in a very real sense, there's no more human being that is Richard Sherman in your eyes, right? He's just become this symbol for sort of black nobility that instrumentalizes him and robs him of his humanity in a very real way.
I think, so I have several observations or reactions to this, which is one, I think you're right that there was something nasty in the initial Richard Sherman as a thug commentary, right? Now, selections of this commentary are often pulled from people on Twitter with 30 or 40 followers, right? And I think you're right that there's a way that thug is a coded way of calling someone the N-word. However, if I'm being totally honest about my own history, is occasionally, as a younger man, and I don't even know until how late into my 20s or life, I might have reacted that way and said, oh, this guy's being a thug, this is, and then sort of got onto a high horse about sportsmanship. Just because it's a sort of a, while still considering myself anti-racist, right? So in a way, it's sort of like, it's just a discourse that people are surrounded with, and then they just adopt it in order to participate, right? It's like, oh, I saw that behavior. Other people call it thuggish behavior. I'm calling it thuggish behavior. It's sort of like, it is the mentality of a 5-year-old, right? I learn what this is. I point to it. I call it what it is. So I do think it's very difficult, and I think this has been a theme in the Redskins debate, is that it's very hard for the more progressive side to win if winning means that in the debate the losing side has to admit, I am a toxic racist, right? So there's that. On the second side, you're right. There's nothing more annoying than like instrumentalizing it, another human being, this way. But what I find interesting about the ennobled black man that saves white people, the magic Negro that Spike Lee talks about in film, is in film the magic Negro is often like poor, saintly, simple. But the type of Richard Sherman, caricature that was painted by his so-called defenders. What's interesting about that is it's so bourgeois, right? It's extremely bougie, right?
Right.
Like, and even sometimes Bill Cosby does this, right? Like that the way to be black is to be middle class in your habits and taste, or maybe even like highbrow. That the only way that black people have their dignity is if they have elevated tastes in jazz and are in like seriously remunerative professions in some way or another. When of course Bill Cosby is an entertainer, which of course is like the classic profession of ethnic and racial groups that are on the make in American life.
Right.
So I don't know. I bring up the bourgeois element of it because you're kind of to the left of not just me but most people that are on blogging heads, and I just wondered if there's any if you felt the same way, that there's this element of kind of a constricted view of what the good life or the dignified life is for everyone, and particularly for blacks. Right.
I think there was actually two strains, which. I think number one, I think there's the sort of Huxtable vision of inoffensive or white-pleasing black masculinity, which is, when people start saying he went to Stanford and he had a 4.0 GPA and, he does all this work for charity. And that's sort of like the Huxtable strain where, like you identify a black man or black people with these sort of bougie values and in that way kind of make them inoffensive.
Right.
I think there was also another strain which was sort of celebrating exactly his sort of in-your-faceness and sort of seeing that as like inherently black. I mean, I read a lot of pieces. I read a lot of pieces that were sort of saying, and this is accurate. Like, throughout history, black men have had to sort of play act a certain kind of unassuming and unaggressive attitude, because if they didn't, they would be perceived as the classically kind of sort of angry black man stereotype, and that's 100% true, and I know that that's true. At the same time, it seemed like a lot of people took that and then sort of identified and sort of said, okay, well, what that means is that because he is here coming across as an angry black man, Richard Sherman is somehow like has become a more real kind of black man, right? And to me, it's the whole point is not that the black man who is forced to act in an unaggressive way because he lives in a racist society. It's not like we want to replace that with a guy who's aggressive just because he's aggressive, but that we shouldn't be developing these sort of external and very white definitions of what sort of it means to be black.
Right, or defining what's acceptable for human dignity just generally. I have a very difficult time doing that. Like I think obviously society should have stigma and social approbation directed towards sort of civilizing impulses everywhere, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean the middle class, 2 cars in a garage in the suburbs, or like tastefully modern, like mid-century modernist decor in your Upper East Side apartment. Like it just seems so narrow.
Right. I could draw an analogy to music. So two white rappers became pretty popular in the last year. There was Macklemore from the States, and I'm not sure if it's Lord or Lordy from New Zealand. And they had these 2 songs that were very popular, Thrift Shop and Royals. And both of those included a kind of an indictment of materialism, and many people thought like an indictment of materialism in rap music. And I read several in several different places, most of them on Tumblr, but I read several different pieces that said some version of this, which is there was a white writer saying, well, look, because Macklemore and Lord or Lordy are criticizing materialism in rap music, and because rap music has a lot of materialism in it, and black people are the people who invented rap music, ergo, those songs are racist because they're being racist against black materialism. Which, if you actually follow that logical chain, the necessary sort of message is black people are materialist, right? Like, there's no way to prosecute that argument unless what you really think is that, like, black people are being really black when they are, being materialist in some rap video. And so inevitably you get this in what they think is the cause of opposing racism. They essentialize blackness and they associate it with sort of vision of blackness that they're comfortable with. I mean, when I read those pieces, I thought to myself, have you ever heard of like Dead Prez, which is probably the most political rap group ever? Like, they're very opposed to materialism in rap music. Like, are they not black enough? And this is something that I
right.
Back in my old blog, I would just be fighting with people about this all the time, where I'd be fighting with liberals all the time, where, there'd be some issue about race, and they'd constantly kind of try to be sort of saying, look, I'm taking the sort of black side on this issue. And I would try to complicate that and say, okay, well, if you're doing that, you're necessarily saying, like, this is the way to be black, and I find that offensive. Or like, with black conservatives, where my readers would be too savvy to come out and say that black conservatives aren't really black, but they would find a lot of coded ways to say that.
Exactly. And I have to say that this is exactly, I think this is one of the things that I sensed in the political correctness kind of movement in the 90s early on, and which made me so acidly skeptical of it. It turned me off. But it is, at the same time, though, now that I'm a grown-up, I see at the same time there's a tension, right? So, at once, we do want to respond as thoughtful human beings and as anti-racists to the kind of idiotic labeling of this or that black behavior as thuggish, when the same behavior from a white player would be deemed like passionate, right. or something like right. that. And we want to avoid the essentializing. And we want to dig underneath the way we talk casually. At the same time, though, it feels like we're creating a just this elaborate courtier way of talking about race at all that is extremely forbidding
right.
to normal human beings, right? That don't spend their time engaging with, like, all of us who have very sensitive rabbit ear antenna to this.
Right.
So I just see that as a tremendous obstacle. And this brings up something I wanted to mention, which is that some people try to be so sensitive. I don't know, Freddie, if you saw that Exo Jane piece about the yoga class.
Mm-hmm.
Did you?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, we'll provide hopefully a link in the side here. Basically the gist of the piece, if you didn't know it, was really skinny, and I imagine like extremely erotically beautiful white woman is in her yoga class, which she considers a place of peace, and a kind of more like rotund black woman comes in, and then this white woman narrates this experience of starting to feel bad for this woman who's not as skinny, beautiful, or white as she is, and she literally like collapses into a crying jag afterward.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a shit ton of commentary about this piece, but my reaction was kind of a simple one, which is that 90% of being a decent human being to people of all races and to black people is not losing your shit the second a black person shows up. Like,
right.
There's a way in which this girl's reaction, she was just so wound tight about, the potential for racism in her yoga class, the potential for her own racism, that she ended up treating this black woman like this insanely delicate hothouse flower. And it's sort of like, it just reminds me of my grandmother who, lived through the 60s, just outside of Newark, New Jersey, and always felt like, shh, be quiet, don't say anything. Sort of like the idea that, like, you're always about to step on a landmine that's going to explode the social order. It's just so paralyzing.
Right. Well, I mean, to the degree that that woman, to the degree that social media can, and like blogs and essays and stuff, can constitute a landmine. She did kind of step on a landmine, but she did it. She did. She did it by writing the essay, right? Like,
yes.
I mean, it's to whatever degree you think that like Twitter or social media or the sort of internet social liberal world has the capacity to punish someone, this woman was punished, right? Now, I think what she wrote was immensely stupid. But as I said, I actually wrote something about this, and I said, it strikes me that she could have expressed similar sentiment. And if she was more aware of the secret language of what it means to be a bougie, liberal, educated person who exists online now, she could have written it in a way that would have gotten celebrated by the same exact people who went after her for it, right?
Yep.
I mean, her biggest problem was that she didn't know these codes. And the thing, like, often, like, a lot of people reacted to that piece, and this happens generally whenever there's one of these controversies, that people say things like, well, how could he or she possibly not know how this is going to come across, right? But that attitude is very indicative of a certain kind of privilege, right?
Oh my God, yes.
It's such a, these codes about how you're supposed to talk about, I mean, everybody now is working out their racial and gender and sexuality baggage online, right? It's all very performative. We're all doing it so everybody else can see. That's probably not a great thing, but I think it's better than the alternative, which is that we don't talk about it. But only some of us are in possession of this enculturated understanding of how you can do that and be safe. I've been around educated, bougie, liberal people my whole life, and for me, it's second nature, right? And even to the point where, like, I write and I fight a lot online, and sometimes I'll have a point I want to make, and I don't want to deal with it. Like, I just don't want to deal with having my position misrepresented or, having people yell at me on social media. So I will write it very carefully, and I will use all these codes in a way that I know how to. And I can do it in a very sort of self-defensive way so that I don't take any flack. And sometimes I want to antagonize those people, and so I write it in a way that I know will cause a lot of flack. But the key is that I have that privilege to be able to manipulate those codes and to be able to use them. And a lot of people don't. And if you spend all day on Twitter and you instinctively know how not to say a stupid thing about race, then that is an immense advantage in that kind of media place or marketplace of attention.
it's interesting that you bring this up because, I have to admit guilt on this, myself. I follow this one Twitter account that's kind of genius called, it's kind of somewhat famous now among the initiated. It's called Fan Since '09. And it's this, typically Fan Since '09 used to be a parody of, a insane Philadelphia sports fan who calls into sports talk radio, right? And so the account would parody the kind of semi-racist things people say and all that. And the account also goes around and searches for kind of fucked up things people say on Twitter and just retweets hundreds of examples of it, right? At Thanksgiving every year, this account retweets hundreds of teenagers saying, fuck you, grandma, I want you to die. Right? Just outrageous stuff. Now these, in a way, it's a very bullying account, right? Because it's its audience is all these smartasses like you and I who know better, right? We're so mannered, we're so courtly, we're so refined. I agree some of these impulses are bad and should be, targeted, but this is being targeted in the most bullying way possible. And the phenomenon now is Twitter has become so unpleasant because, or at least the Twitter that I read, and I think the Twitter that you would read if you were tweeting all the time, is this phenomenon. I notice sometimes if I don't check into Twitter for a weekend, I'll have missed an enormously important landmark in 2-minute hating over the weekend, a hate read that now everyone in my social circle, from a professional social circle, knows about and has formulated the proper opinion about. It's this little, Twitter has these hurricanes that happen in your pocket while you're unaware.
I think it's important to clarify, if I thought that this stuff worked in the sense that it could sort of transcend this this narrow social circle and actually make the world better for the people that it's supposed to be making the world better for, if I thought that that all of this stuff was making the world a more feminist, a less racist, a more queer-friendly kind of a place, then I would probably just accept the fact that it's going to involve, the ritual sacrifice of some people who say stupid shit. I would say that would be, a few eggs that you'd have to crack in order to make that omelet. I have no idea what the theory of politics is. Michelle Goldberg wrote that piece about Twitter feminism.
Yes, I thought you'd bring that up.
I mean, it's a piece that I was very conflicted about, and I don't feel like I have a super coherent take on it, in part because the stakes are just not the same for me as they are for a lot of people. But that being said, I mean, a lot of people expressing sort of Michelle Goldberg's standpoint seem more interested in is this fair? Is it kind? Is there human compassion? For me, the question just is it accomplishing anything? And what I would love to see some people do is to express a theory of politics where they say, okay, this is what I'm trying to get, and this is how my current practice gets me there. But unfortunately, asking those kind of questions about efficacy has itself become off limits. If you ask someone hey, do you think that this particular communicative practice is politically useful? Then they'll say that you're tone policing. They'll say don't tone police me, don't tell me how to live my politics. But there's just I don't think that sort of the best case scenario for any political speech is that people who used to be on one side become convinced by the other side, and then they join and they become people who work practically for these good causes. I don't see a lot of that happening, and I think that the level of danger for those who are not yet initiated is perceived as being so high that, I mean, if you're someone who is thinking about getting involved in these politics, but you are not quite sure, or you're on the fence, or you don't just have the vocabulary, you haven't read all the bell hooks that you need to read, and you show up and you say one wrong thing and you get 50 people just raining angry tweets at you, you're not going to become a better feminist. You're going to turn off Twitter and you're not going to come back.
That's exactly right. No, there's something like Twitter is a great place to like perform and reaffirm your membership in certain communities.
Right.
But it's very bad at mobilizing it, right? Like this, no one has written a letter from a Birmingham jail on Twitter, or ever will, right? There's no hashtag that's going to. I just having seen also the purported Twitter revolutions across the globe, and having read enough Yevgeny Morozov, I just think it's a poor format. But at the same time, it's a place where all these writers at magazines that and in public forums that should, be trying to write the letter from the Birmingham jail, or at least, provocative, pro-social, pro-justice columns, are convivial with each other. So it's a riddle. I don't have a great transition. I think we could leave that there. Okay. But I know you wanted to talk a little bit about Sochi, the Olympic coverage, and I've become very interested in this too. But let's hear you first.
Yeah, I just think that, and present company excluded, of course, Michael. This is why I fucking hate journalists, all right? Like, I'm following this coverage of, like, the bathroom situation in Sochi, right? And, when journalists want to get kind of self-mythologizing about their profession, they talk, we're out there in the foxholes with these guys, it's danger all the time. Meanwhile, like, there's a million tweets, like, I can't find a Starbucks in Russia, or, like, people, I think it was on Instagram, and it was, like, it was some sports journalist, and he had said, our hotel in Sochi is a shambles. And the picture is literally of, like, there's a broken curtain rod in his room, right? And it's like, yes, that's right. I wonder how you'll find the strength to survive with your curtain rod broken in Sochi. And the thing is like, I think that this is indicative of a broader thing, not just Russia, not just this Olympic Games. And by the way, obviously this is very different from the just absolutely horrific and just really disturbing crackdown on homosexuality in Russia, which is just incredibly depressing to me. But there's this broader phenomenon in American media now, and I feel like it's a growing concern, which is you point out the backwardsness of other countries or the brokenness in other countries. And it's great clickbait. And I just have to think that the genesis of that is that so many people feel so bad about where the United States is and who are so worried about the long-term future of this country that it becomes very convenient to sort of be able to say, oh, well, look at Russia, look at how crazy it is over there. Or like the endless series of, haha, look at how weird things are in China. So like all these fake viral videos like, the Chinese had to put up a fake sunrise because no one could see it because of the bad air.
Right.
And to me, it's just like a straightforward way to say, like, we feel really scared and unhappy about where our country is going. So let's sort of push our problems off onto someone else so that we can feel superior for a little while.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I would extend what you said even further, even to a lot of the performed concern for homosexuals in Russia, right? Like, I don't know. I mean, increasingly, it's horrible because I have to express 4 or 5 opinions a week for my day job now. But, like, expressing opinions is so cheap, It's so cheap. It's so easy, right, to lament causes like that, especially ones that are so fashionable, right?
Right.
Like, there are several major media organizations or tech companies that are drawing attention to this particular issue.
Right.
Right? And I don't want to weigh one cause against another, but it's like I wrote about the kind of systematic murder, torture, exile of Christians in Middle Eastern countries, where our money is directly involved, right? Where our money or our influence over their form of government has been directly involved in the past decade. And, it got like buzz for 2-3 days. People acknowledged like, oh, this is moral and good. And then they just, went back to sharing viral videos, and that was it, right?
Right.
Because it's not going to be that's not a fashionable cause. Now with Russia, it's interesting to me because, sure, I deplore, the kind of like authoritarianism over there. There's something like corrupt and dirty about, or at least that's way it seems from where I sit in Westchester County. Of course, right? Literally like 98% of the world is dirtier and more corrupt than Westchester County, New York.
Right.
But there's a couple of criticisms that I thought were really sharp, which is that, are we really criticizing Russia for being less efficient at totalitarianism than Beijing was?
Right.
Exactly. Is that really the direction we want to go in? Which is like, hey, we expect a seamless experience over here.
What we expect, Michael, is that our declared enemy states will appear to be, up to the task of being our enemy, right?
Right.
When you see the rot that is sort of within Russia, and you see how the basic infrastructure doesn't work, you say to yourself, well, that doesn't fit my Red Dawn fantasy anymore. I need the countries that we don't like to be up to the task of being our antagonist.
Yeah, I mean, and also, there's also the populist right-winger in me, that kind of longs for the clarity of the Cold War. Mm-hmm. That's in me too, and I'm thinking, hey, back in the day, Russia was impressive enough that Walter Duranty would cover up like practical genocide in the New York Times, and now journalists are freaking out about broken curtain rods.
Toilets, right? Yeah.
It's like we've gone from like ignoring an invasion of Hungary. Right. Or saying, like, who cares, to, like, complaining about where the toilet paper goes. Right. It's just, I mean, I guess that's the decline of Russian civilization.
Well, you mentioned the Beijing Games, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely everybody agrees that the Beijing Games were sort of flawlessly pulled off. And like you just made now, some people made the point, like, that's what totalitarianism is good at, like, right, this kind of, or at least authoritarianism. But where are the, Chinese Olympic venues now? Most of them are just like literally crumbling and have no use, no purpose.
Yep,
right?
They're all white elephants now.
There's a couple of buildings that they still use, and the rest are like literally just rotting in the streets of Beijing. So I would feel remiss if I didn't point out, for the very sort of terrible situation with the gay people in Russia, I think that being a kind of very much not a sort of adventurist kind of foreign policy person, I think that the easiest thing we can do for them would be to offer blanket asylum in the United States to gay Russian people to come and stay here. But I guess that's a tangential point. One thing I want to point out is, you mentioned that there's lots of places that don't look good as Westchester, right? And this is a thing that I think that I wonder if a lot of people in the media who sort of mostly stay in New York, D.C., or Los Angeles are aware of, like, some of those places that are a lot more corrupt and a lot more broken down than Westchester happen to be in the United States.
Yeah, like look at West Virginia right now.
Right.
Right now they don't have drinking water in a lot of West Virginia. This was a problem supposedly solved 80 years ago in America.
Right. And the thing is, it's one thing, I think that, like, if you ask people in the media, like, they can quote to you, like, just the absolutely flatlined real wages for Americans, and the fact that the cost for education and healthcare and housing have shot through the roof, so, the actual money to spend is way down. But it's another thing, like, living out here in the Midwest right now, you drive through, old sort of industrial areas of Ohio or here in Indiana, and it's just these rotting cities. You know what I mean? I mean, just so many dilapidated small towns where everything is broken, and there's just filled with people who just hang out on the street all day because they don't have jobs, they don't have anywhere to go. And it's just remarkable to me because, these are the sort of things that we used to laugh about, that people used to laugh about that happened in other countries. And that's sort of where we are now. I mean, probably also, by the way, the funniest thing, literally the funniest thing I saw, I think it was on the gadget blog Gizmodo. And it said, if you're going to be a journalist at Sochi, you better be ready for the Russian government to read all of your emails. And I was thinking to myself, boy, I wonder what that's like when your government is conducting bulk surveillance of all of your electronic communication. What a backwards third world condition to live in,
Oh, Freddie. Yeah, it is. No, the scandal of the way we react to Russia is it's sad for me, right? So it's like, yeah, I can recite all the pro forma things I think are bad or wrong about the Russian government.
Mm-hmm. Me too.
But absolutely. There is sort of like, they are real people, and even as this, even as Russia is run by like a clique of, I described them this week as authoritarian conservative nationalists, mm-hmm. right? That Russia seems to be developing as its alternative to Western liberalism, a kind of nationalist, reactionary form of government, mm-hmm. right? And I pointed out that this is a kind of like a funny inversion of the Cold War world, where like America was the conservative, nationalist, reactionary power on the planet, crushing left-wing dissent at home, right? I mean, all of this is kind of a little bit drawn out for effect, right? What I'm saying, right. But I'm a big believer in that. While at the same time, most people like me, are pretty powerless over what form of government we have. Mm-hmm. I do believe there is a general way in which people get and tolerate governments because of what they're willing to put up with, right? Right. Yeah. This is obviously very shorthand for a lot of complicated ideas. Right. But I think there are historical reasons that help at least to explain or help us to understand why Russia is going in the direction it is, right? Right. And some of these are economic reasons about its resource richness compared to other countries, or the historical way that the Soviet Union was broken apart and devolved to the control of oligarchs. Right. There's a reason why Putin is hailed by so many Russian people. Right. It's not just cowering fear. They're not North Korea. Right.
I mean, the thing is, I think the big point for me is that, we don't have to engage in any apologetics at all for the Russian government, which I think we both agree is, kind of a nightmare. But we do, I think it makes sense just to be intelligent people to understand the conditions that create things like this, and not to ascribe it to some kind of like poor Russian character or something, like as if, it's just the people are bad, because that leads us to not understand sort of like systemic reasons why these conditions are created. If you look at like the Soviet Union, I have absolutely no excuses to make for the Soviet Union. However, when people point out like, oh, their economy went in the toilet after World War II, it's like, yeah, they lost like literally like a third of their population in World War II, And the point is never to make an excuse. The point is just to say like, we let ourselves off the hook when we assume that like, the Chinese people haven't revolted against the party yet. It's because they have this authoritarian mindset. They prefer to be, under the control of somebody, and I for me, it's just the basic point is, I mean, as someone who is a long-term and very harsh critic of the American government, I hear from people all the time, like, do you ask these questions of the Iranian government? Do you ask these questions of North Korea? Like, where are your pieces going after Saudi Arabia? And I just say to them, I'm a citizen of the United States, and by absolutely any political theory, as a member of a democracy, it's part of my moral responsibility to look to my country first. So the point when I say...
Oh my gosh, my Buchananite heart just like engorged itself.
Well, it's just like, it's like with Sochi, it's like, oh, you complain about how they're making fun of Sochi, but like, don't you think the United States is in better shape? And like, of course I do, but the United States is my responsibility, right? Cleveland, the suburban area around Cleveland, is my responsibility in a way that Sochi isn't. And so I insist that you talk about the devastation in suburban Cleveland more often than you make fun of the toilets in Sochi.
And not only that, I mean, listen, we're being a little hard, right? Because we're talking about the media as like a singular beast.
Right, not true.
And it's multi-headed. So like, listen, sports reporters from ESPN and from whatever, if they're tweeting out about the toilets, okay, fine,
Right.
But it is actually more incumbent on the columnists that are kind of more in my world and the world you read to like have some fucking perspective. There was a brilliant tweet. I don't know who the person was because I only just followed them, pointing out like, we're laughing at Sochi's toilets, but we're the ones that have like been occupying Afghanistan corruptly for 13 years.
Right. With nothing to show for it. With nothing to show for it, right?
With nothing to show for it, right? So it's like... But, if the Olympics weren't in Russia, it would be the funniest thing if Russia could just say, like, hey, we don't know if we want to participate in these Olympics because of the occupation of Afghanistan. Nothing would, in a sense, would, like, make me giggle more than if we had our own preening thrown in our face like that.
Exactly.
Because we react horribly when some foreigner deigns to criticize American foreign policy, right? Like the axis of weasels. Obviously that was done, those New York Post covers were done during war fever.
Right.
But, could you imagine if Russia was boycotting the Olympics because of the occupation of Afghanistan by a hostile foreign power? It would just be beautiful in a way.
Right.
Yeah. Wow. So...
Pitchers and catchers?
Pitchers and catchers, yeah. let's just say I'm excited for baseball. I'm excited for year 2 of the Slurve. I keep promising we'll start doing more editions more frequently soon. By spring training, they'll be every day again.
Right.
But, yeah, baseball... we just spent the beginning of this podcast talking about sports as like this microcosm of these greater social discussions about race. But God, there is a relief in 9-inning games and pitchers' duels and like fantasy baseball.
Right.
For the way football in particular is set up, where you have a weekend of games and then a week of analysis, that creates a necessary kind of like crisis industry in the sports media. If you're a football writer, right, if you cover a beat for one team, you have 3 hours of action and then a week that you have to fill with content. And so you have all these ESPN created and sports world created narratives that just flare up again and again and again. Whereas with baseball, it's 162 games. Like, even the most dedicated beat reporters usually don't see every game,
That's right.
And there is a very, like, sort of charming, I find, inconsequential nature to a baseball game now, where, on the one extreme, you have a sport like college football where every game is do or die. Like, you lose a game and you're not going to win the national championship. And then on the other extreme, you have a game like baseball where it's like, the odds of the only way that something really monumental is going to happen in one baseball game is if it's at the very end of the year or there's a major injury, which when I was a younger man, that might have been a reason not to like baseball, but more and more it's a kind of a reason I do like baseball.
Yeah, it's also, that you might get a no-hitter or something like that that's kind of memorable, or a perfect game. But the way those pop up kind of like at random is also a great comfort of baseball, right? Because you can be rewarded. You're sitting on your couch, you're kind of walking around the house, You're maybe like listening to some music or like thumbing through Twitter or blogs or something, and all of a sudden you're realizing, gosh, it's the sixth inning and there's a no-hitter going on. I love that level of engagement in baseball, and it's actually the 162 games is what makes the Slurve sensible, right?
Right.
Like, if I tried to do that for football, like send out 100 links a day to people during the season, it would be so fucking annoying.
Right.
Like, how many times can we read about like one possible injury? You know, one score. You know, you have to be reminded of it 7 days a week. I did buy a football domain, but I just can't. I can't bring myself to do anything with it.
Well, you're already wearing a lot of hats, so.
Yeah, I am. Yeah, weekend bodyguard of Pope Emeritus Benedict and husband. Yeah, there's a lot of roles I play. You know, Freddie, this is just to end this on a meta note. We should find ways to disagree with each other.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm sure we'll find something sooner or later.
Yeah, I mean, I am a black-hearted reactionary. You're a red-hearted commie. There should be something. But it seems that all the pressing political, social, and moral issues of the day, you're just my buddy. I just want to end on that note.
I think we should nationalize all the sports teams. Nationalize them.
Well, you know, I was thinking actually while we were speaking earlier that one way to calm down the constant status gamesmanship among journalists would be just to provide them like tenure and permanent employment.
Right. So they wouldn't have to perform all the time, right? Like,
right, like you could just ease their anxiety of like, am I losing status right now on Twitter while I'm not looking at it? Like, is someone tweeting something nasty about my piece right now? You would just loosen that up.
You know what's incredible, and this is we're wrapping up, so I don't mean to get on a tangent here, but
no, it's perfect.
Just like the public funding for stadiums. It's like if you decided to socialize the risks of some of the most successful businesses in the country, right? It's like the NFL, like getting local communities to pay for NFL stadiums. It's $1 billion industry. You can't. It's hard to think of a more financially successful industry than the NFL, and they're pouring hundreds of millions of dollars of public money into these stadiums. Meanwhile, like, you know, the National Endowment for the Arts, I think it's like its yearly budget is like $50 and like a bus pass now. You know what I'm saying? It's like baseball. Baseball's the worst too in a way because it's like it not only takes advantage of public subsidies, but it also has like it is kind of criminally sad that baseball players, even while their union is kind of getting their butt kicked, it's still by far the most successful union in the world. Well, you've got these antitrust exemptions, right? Like, I mean, if I'm a billionaire, I can't just start a new MLB team, right? And that hurts players a great deal because if I had the ability to just start a new MLB team, then I could bid up for those players. I could say, hey, come play for me. But the antitrust exemption makes that not possible. And it's such a successful
it's such a successful industry though that like even with the union being a little weak against the owners now currently because of the antitrust exemption, they're still pretty fucking well fed at the professional level, right?
The funny thing is, here's my secret theory about baseball finances. Why are like the Dodgers worth $2 billion or whatever it was? Well, it's because, in very large measure, because of that television contract they signed, right?
Yeah.
Why, if you're a television station, would you pay that much money to broadcast baseball? Well, baseball is a very safe way to get consistent, if not very high, but consistent ratings, right? Well, ratings come from advertising, right? Well, why? So then, like the source of all this money, like, I mean, what it's all based on is this television advertising. And one of the things that we've found in the online world is that just like we have all these metrics for why online advertisements don't work very well. But that's precisely what makes television advertising, I think, so valuable, is that we don't know that it's not working in the same way that we don't.
Exactly. Oh,
Right?
my gosh. You've hit on something that I've been suspecting ever since I got into the clicks game at Business Insider years ago, which is that we just don't know what television advertising is worth.
Yeah, and even print, it's print is dead and everything is digital, except in the actual cost department, how much revenue you get for an ad in the print New York Times, it blows out of the water what you get on the online New York Times. And I think it's precisely because nobody knows that nobody cares, right? There's no way to check.
I'll say this though. I totally thought the same thing you thought. I have one complicating thought for you, though.
Okay.
Which is this. And this is a sign of my privilege. I write a lot of pieces online. I've written a lot of pieces online at prestigious outlets, right? Mm-hmm. To me, my dream, I published in ESPN magazine. That magazine has, millions of people touch that magazine every week. What an immense privilege.
Yeah.
I will tell you, if I'm on television for a minute, I am guaranteed that people I haven't talked to in years will contact me and say, "Hey, I saw you on television."
Yeah. That's very powerful. You're right. That's a good
right?
point.
So it's like I'm writing for magazines that I think reach millions of people, that millions of people read. Mm-hmm. But if I'm on, the F segment on MSNBC, on a show that's really isn't doing great in the ratings,
right,
gangbusters-wise, I get contacted by all sorts of people like, "Hey, I saw you." And so I've come to think maybe, we can't measure television advertising
right,
with the kind of ruthless consistency of dollars invested to dollars gained that
right,
you can in the online world where you click through and buy. But boy, television is still king.
Mike Trout is going to sign a $350 million contract someday, and when he does, he'll have television ratings to thank for that television advertising.
Yeah, fascinating. Listen, we should call it. Otherwise, everyone will get mad at us at BHTV.
Alrighty,
Freddie, it's been great. I'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you later.